Okay, I think we can start at least. Welcome all of you in today's session of the Interuniversity Program Aula Mediterrània, which is organized by the European Institute of the Mediterranean, together with, in this case, the Masters in Advanced Studies in International Affairs and the Masters in International Journalism from Ramon Llull University. I have the pleasure to be here in a double condition as professor in this master's, but also as director of the Arab and Islamic department at IEMed. And today we have the great pleasure of having with us Professor A.J. Hellyer. I think sometimes the introduction of the presentation is not necessary, probably in this case, particularly for those who have been following the region for a while. Probably you have read him, you have followed him in his social media accounts, in Twitter, and probably you already know part of his work. But for those who are new in this, we have master degrees attending this program from several disciplines, so not only international relations or political science. So for those who do not know so well Professor Hellyer, I'm going just to give some words about him. He's a Cambridge University Fellow. He's also a Senior Fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute. He has served in prestigious institutions as well, previously at Brookings Institution and at the Atlantic Council. He is, above all, a prominent intellectual in the West and in the Arab and Islamic world. In fact, he has been included in the list of the Muslim 500 of these prominent people who shape opinion, ideas in the world. And he focused particularly on politics, international studies, and religion. In fact, he has also acted as advisor for the UK government's task force, as independent scholar on issues related to radicalization and violent extremism. And he's normally contributing to several international media, such as the Washington Post or other very well-known media. He has also written several books. I could recommend reading some of them, like Muslims of Europe, The Other Europeans, or Engagement with the Muslim Community and Counter-Terrorism, British Lessons for the West, or one which I really love, which is A Revolution Undone, Egypt's Road Beyond Revolt, among many others. I remember very precisely the time that Professor Hellyer spent and informed the whole world audience through Twitter and through social media on what was going on in Egypt after 11 years ago in Egypt, after it was in fact yesterday, 25th January, when the Arab Revolution in Egypt and the Egyptian Revolution started. And I remember how we learned from what was going on the ground, from the messages and the writings of Professor Hellyer. Today, I think it's an honor and a pleasure to be listening to him and to have the chance to exchange some ideas, opinions, and questions with him after his lecture. For all of you, you are invited to send your questions through the Q&A tool that you have here in Zoom. And also for those following the YouTube streaming, you can send your questions through there, and we will also gather them and convey them to Professor Hellyer, so that at the end of the lecture, we hope we can have a nice discussion and a nice exchange. We deeply regret that we cannot have him personally in Barcelona, but hopefully we will have other chances to force him to come to Barcelona and to be with us face to face. So having said that, Professor Hellyer, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Lourdes, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings. Some of you, it might be morning. as it happens to be for me at the moment, or indeed afternoon or evening. So hello to all of you. And again, thank you very much to the European Institute of the Mediterranean for the kind invitation, particularly Elisabetta, Lourdes, Jordi. I'm very grateful. My thanks to them. And my thanks also to all of you as the audience for making time as well during an age where we're all inundated with Zoom calls to agreeing to doing another Zoom. And I assure you, you won't need to force me to come to Barcelona. I will be very happy to come whenever it's possible, inshallah. So I'll start with a few sort of framing comments. I intend to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we go into questions and discussions and so on. That's really my what I'm looking forward to today, to engaging with all of you. But some framing comments first, partly about my own research, but partly about the region and this particular conversation. When Joseph Biden became the president of the United States, I remember very clearly there were all these flurries of articles and commentaries insisting that he would pivot to Asia, and that at the very least the wider Arab world and the Middle East region would become deprioritized. I know I wrote one of them, and my colleagues and I, in what pundits often call the blob, that nebulous group of analysts and academics and media commentators and policy wonks inside and outside of government, we deployed various arguments to justify our positions. And I don't deny those arguments. I think they generally hold true because the broad trend of American democracy, which indelibly affects the rest of Western diplomacy, as DC is still the Rome of the modern Western empire, is indeed in that direction. The developing geopolitics of the world means that China is a growing power of the future, and we're already really in that future. But what I think most of those arguments didn't note emphatically, perhaps because analysts of the region take this for granted, I don't know, is that a Biden White House was never going to cut and run from the region. It's just not very feasible, at least not in the short to medium term, and probably far beyond that. The broader Middle East continues to be very relevant for Western policymakers. And for us as Europeans, it's because it is on our doorstep. We share the Mediterranean Sea with the region. We have extensive trade relations with it. For Washington, there are economic, military, and other relationships that are not simply going to evaporate, and this is true for European capitals as well. And nor does it seem do we actually want to cut and run anyway. There's too much to be gained from those trade relationships, to put it bluntly, on the one hand, and we continue to want to see stability, in quotation marks, in countries that are close to us, because again, bluntly, we are concerned as to what it means for us if they become unstable, as though they're stable anyway, but we'll get to that. I put stable and unstable all in quotation marks because we use those words in ways that are essentially very self-serving. They bear little resemblance to what genuine, rooted, sustainable stability actually means. And we also, unfortunately, continue to view the region via frames and lenses that diminish and depreciate what the region means for the people that matter the most in this regard. Not the regimes that govern or fail to govern the region, but for the masses of people that live there. But we'll come back to that later on. What I want to discuss tonight is all that I've mentioned thus far, but more than that. I want to get into what the geopolitics are actually most of all about. I'm going to be discussing different axes and poles of influence and what they're based on. But I want to be clear, I'm doing this as a Western analyst attached to Cambridge University, as was mentioned, as a fellow, but also as a senior associate of the Royal United Services Institute in London and the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C., as a veteran of not just one, but three of DC's think tanks. So I'm very, mentally ensconced within that sort of arena. But I'm not going to be speaking from purely that vantage point, and I want to foreground that in advance, because my interest in the region isn't simply that of an interested but dispassionate external observer whose English father and grandfather and great-grandfather, until I frankly have no idea, were of the British Isles. My interest is that of someone of the region, the son of a Cairene lady whose own parents were of Egyptian, Sudanese, and Moroccan extraction. My interest is that of an Englishman, a European, a Westerner, but also of an Arab who was born in the region, spent many years living there during my formative years, and who chose to spend much of the last decade and more within it, attempting to bear witness to the tumultuous and painful and glorious, I must say, events of that time. And I must say that today is the 26th of January, and every time the 25th comes around, anyone who was in Egypt at that time, or any Egyptian who was out of it, the 25th is etched in our, not in our heads or in our memories, but in our hearts, really, and continues to be so. And I really want to foreground this sort of perspective, because all too often we do tend to analyze or interpret the events underway in the region without keeping in mind whom it most matters to, the people of the region, the people who live there, the people who are tied to it after they are forced to leave, the people for whom there is no other real home on this planet of ours. We need means to us as Britons, as Europeans, as Westerners. Now, in March of 2016, then US President Barack Obama said that wars and chaos in the Middle East would not end until Saudi Arabia and Iran can find a way to share the neighborhood and make some kind of peace. And there is much to unpack from this statement in many different ways, but I'll pick on 2 points. The first, which I think is an overriding concern, is just the way in which such statements, and they're reflective of a particular mentality and paradigm, but in the way it turns the region into some kind of 18th century tribal fiefdom, where two empires led by imperial leaders can divide the spoils between them. And it's quite outdated, but alas, this does permeate a lot of discussions we have about the region. I'm not sure I know that many people in the region who would want to live under either Saudi Arabian or Iranian hegemony if they could have a better option. Say, accountable and representative government that protected their fundamental freedoms and rights. But all too often we continue to see the region in that fashion. That phrase, sharing the neighborhood, particularly stuck in my craw when I heard it, but it's so common to speak in that way, whether in London or in DC or elsewhere for that matter. But the second point, which is why Obama's statement was peculiar, is from a geopolitical analytical lens, because this competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran was no longer the only major one in town. Even in 2016, there was a new competition that had been picking up steam since early 2012 and had crystallized in 2013 and began to permeate and continues to be very relevant. That competition was fundamentally between two axes. And without understanding those two axes, one will find it very difficult indeed to understand how the region's geopolitics are evolving. It's rather difficult, if not impossible, to understand the main poles of power in the region today without presenting a definition of a singularly notorious word. And that word is Islamism. And I say it is notorious because it means so many different things to so many different people. And yet it continues to have utility because so many people continue, as they have done for many decades now, to self-describe as Islamists. And there are particular levels of definitions in many fields, and I think that Islamism is no different in this regard. The most broad level would be the following, that Islamism is the instrumentalization of certain interpretations of Islam, not Islam, but certain interpretations of Islam, by those who would describe themselves as Islamists for the purpose of political power. I think that's a fair definition. I think all of those elements are important. And firstly, it's important to note that Islamism is fundamentally about instrumentalization, and that instrumentalization is fundamentally about power. And second, I think it's important to note that this is a self-ascribed label, i.e., while very few in English might describe themselves as Islamists, although there are some, there are certainly those who do so in Arabic. In English, the corresponding label might be the so-called Islamic movement. Thirdly, it's important and necessary to distinguish between Islam as a normative noun to delineate the religion in its normative forms, historically speaking, and Islamism, which is by far reliant on quite modern interpretations that find their roots in the last 100 years. It's for this reason that so many opponents to Islamism happen to be also deeply religious and often quite conservative Muslims. But I digress. Maybe we'll come back to that later. The first axis is the Qatari, Turkey, and I would argue MB, Muslim Brotherhood network axis. When it comes to Qatar, we're talking about a singular nation state. When we talk about Turkey, we're talking about the Erdogan-led AK party within Turkey. When we talk about the Brotherhood, we're discussing the vast networks that exist in the Arab world that claim some kind of fealty to or inspiration by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an interesting conglomerate and not one that is necessarily ideologically cohesive. Qatar would not fathom of democratic elections. Turkey has much procedural democracy, even if the increasing autocratic tendencies therein sometimes put stress on those processes, but it is a democratic state. The Brotherhood is historically a modernist Salafi movement from Abdu and then on. Qatar is historically a Wahhabi kingdom, even while it has supported many Brotherhood elements in the region. Turkey's religious establishment is fundamentally attached to normative Sunnism, very distinct from modernist Salafism, which created a very different type of political Islamism unique to Turkey and quite unlike the Brotherhood, historically speaking. The second axis is arguably just as disparate. The Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian axis finds itself thrown together, particularly after the end of the democratic experiment in Egypt in 2013. The religio-ideological consistency is just as absent. The Saudis continue to uphold purist Salafism as the true form of Islam, while the UAE and Egypt are far more inclined to, at least rhetorically, talk about normative Sunnism in terms of doctrine. There will be those that will argue that the latter axis is the counter-revolutionary axis and the former is the revolutionary axis. And I find this to be a poor framing, not because I don't think that the former axis is counter-revolutionary, but rather that they're all counter-revolutionary or support revolutionary processes wherever it meets their interests. And I'll try to explain that. But the framing itself as counter-revolutionary versus revolutionary, I think is a sorely poor framing. When the uprisings of Libya and Syria began, the Emiratis and the Qataris both supported them, even while they supported different actors on the ground. When the Bahraini uprising began, both of those GCC states opposed it. So it's not about support for revolution or opposition to it even per se, but rather about what outcome serves a particular state's cynical interpretation of its own interest. When Sudan faced its own uprising over the last couple of years, all of these actors opposed it to begin with. And eventually all of them signed up to it, seeing that their interests would be served accordingly. But there are certain things that do tie the different axes together, and that has to do with the convergence of interests and attitudes vis-a-vis the role of specifically mainstream Islamist political groups and the continuation of political orders in the region that meet their purposes. For the first axis, due to their own sympathies with political Islamism that find their roots in the Brotherhood and sympathetic movements like the AKP, that generally means supporting uprising where this would increase their reach in this regard and not where it wouldn't. And obviously the opposite is the case for the Saudi-led axis, where an uprising, if it takes place, if they think that it's going to work out in their political favor, then they will support it. And if they don't, then they will not. It's as simple as that. Now I hasten to add two additional points here. These axes are not only rifted internally in terms of actual doctrine when we're talking religiously speaking, because religion comes up a lot in this discussion, but also in terms of political assessments. So for example, the Emiratis and the Saudis viewed Syria in a particular way for several years, and then they changed. And before they changed, this view was very much at odds with how the Egyptians viewed Syria when Sisi came into power. The same was true and remains to be true when it comes to the absolutely disastrous war in the Yemen. Although now the Emiratis and the Saudis have differed on that score as well at different times. So using the axes as frames of reference for analysis is useful, but it's not always the complete picture. There are things that are very important to note internally within those axes as well. The second, and I think this is very important, is that the axis led by the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptian, it's not above instrumentalizing religion for partisan political purposes as well. Far from it. If that instrumentalization is a main feature of the other axis, it's certainly not less than a prominent characteristic, to say the least, of the Emirati, Egyptian, Saudi axis. We've seen all of those countries instrumentalize religion many times to promote their own visions for the region, as well as domestically. None of that is exceptional or unusual for them. It is entirely in keeping with how they look at the world. I would also argue it's tremendously unhealthy. There are differences with the pro-MB axis, of course. For example, there's a lot, you'll find, I won't say a lot, that's not fair, but you will find anti-Christian sectarianism, which can be found in this other axis, but you can also find anti-Shi'i sectarianism among a lot within the anti-MB axis. We used to say that British politicians don't do God, unlike our American counterparts. Well, in these axes, everybody does God, for better or for worse, and usually, unfortunately, for worse. One cannot say another aspect that I think is very similar between the two axes is, one can't say that one axis is more pro-nation state than the other. The Turks, for example, are incredibly pro-nation state, as are the Emiratis and the Egyptians. So it's not that sort of ideological breakdown at all. But they are still poles. They are still two axes, and they are poles that have clashed tremendously. This, as I've mentioned, the Saudi, UAE, Egyptian axis versus that Qatari axis, Qatari-Turkish axis, has, in the words of the ICG, the International Crisis Group, and I quote, polarized Arab politics cast a long shadow over North Africa, for years split the Syrian opposition, and now plays out in the Horn of Africa, notably exacerbating rifts among Somali factions. As the axes crystallized from 2013 to 2016, they were met with a new opportunity, that of the Trump administration at the beginning of 2017, which encouraged and emboldened the worst impulses from within the region, and these axes included. And shortly thereafter, that led to a crucial break, one that meant that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt severed diplomatic ties with and boycotted Qatar, demanding that it break with the MB, close the Turkish military base, shut down its Al Jazeera news network, among other demands that were never particularly likely to be met, but they were made anyway. These two poles are real. Now, for all that I've said about how important these poles are, I'm reminded that a few years ago, I stood in front of another academic gathering at the 30th anniversary of the Journal of Islamic Studies in Oxford on the same topic, after having explained these axes. And I said, now, having established the usefulness of these frames for understanding and analysis, and I stand by that, I will now seemingly contradict myself, because I fundamentally believe that going forward, these frames are going to become increasingly irrelevant. And I think that still bears out today, and even more so. The poles remain. Okay, so it's really important to understand these poles in order to do analytical research of any type. But they offer, nevertheless, in a wider region that is not a vacuum, that is not in the absence of flux, and which has various push and pull factors, which create all kinds of opportunities when powers become exhausted. That happened with the GCC crisis, even while the existence of the Trump administration and what awful things it did for the deterioration of the international and regional orders, let alone at home in the United States, was crucial for the beginning of the GCC crisis. That same administration was still pushing Riyadh to end the crisis. And perhaps the coronavirus pandemic was partly responsible. Perhaps the shifting of geotectonic plates due to the Abraham Accords, which we won't spend too much time on in my speech, but maybe in questions and answers we'll give it whatever time it deserves, which isn't particularly much. Riyadh felt the need to clear the deck. Perhaps the victory of Joe Biden as president meant that Riyadh had to renew its importance in DC, perhaps its most important global ally, or perhaps all of these things. In any case, it meant that the GCC crisis came to a rather quick end at last year. And the rapprochement followed. And for all the rhetoric of demonization going back and forth, Saudi and Qatari officials are back on good terms. Even between Cairo and Doha, that is true. We've seen over the last year the Turks unexpectedly giving all sorts of signals about wanting to mend bridges with the Egyptians, with the Emiratis, with the Saudis, all of whom they vigorously opposed, at least in terms of rhetoric. Turkish-Egyptian differences were very, very pronounced, and despite all of that, relations have improved quite substantially, to the point where it's only a matter of time, I think, before we have the Turkish foreign minister go to Cairo and so on. Even when it comes to Libya, too, one of the major places of difference and distinction between these two axes, things have moved. It's not perfect, but it's certainly not where it was a couple of years ago. It wasn't long ago that the country was the venue for one of the most severe conflicts between these two axes, playing out in a proxy war, the UAE and Egypt on one side and the Turks and the Qataris on the other. But that didn't last indefinitely. The UAE and Egypt now see things quite differently from each other when it comes to Libya. Partly, frankly, because while Cairo can afford to be maximalist domestically, it's actually very pragmatic beyond its borders, and particularly when it comes to a country that shares a massive border with, Libya. And it comes at a good time. The combination of different political moves domestically and externally managed to bring an end to the stalemate in Libya. And we hope that over the coming months things will improve, even though the signals are quite concerning. But the two axes are no longer about to go to war with each other in Libya. And I think that's something that's good for the people of Libya, but also tells us something about these axes and how permanent their difficulties between each other are. There is a thawing, and that thawing is continuing between these axes, particularly between Turkey and Egypt, but also beyond. And there are other moves that are afoot. When the Biden administration originally took office, Cairo was particularly concerned about what this might mean for Egypt, particularly Biden's pointed attack of Sisi during his presidential campaign, calling him Trump's favorite dictator. And certainly relations between Cairo and DC are nothing compared to what they were under Donald Trump. The temperature is much cooler. But having said that, the honeymoon of the divorce, as it were, is over, with Israel bombarding Gaza in yet another round of incredibly disproportionate use of force and, frankly, war crimes. There was a reminder that was brought to bear on the Biden administration, as well as the rest of the region, for all of the talk about a resetting of the region due to the Abraham Accords. We were back to the future. The Biden administration didn't suddenly engage with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis to address this crisis. They went to the powers that actually had genuine leverage, and those were the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and especially the Egyptians, as the ones who had strong relations with Hamas in Gaza, the Israelis, and the Palestinian Authority. You can't ignore that in favor of some kind of peculiar imaginary restructuring. And it was also a reminder to the other axis of Turkey and Qatar. They couldn't, nor did they even really try to take over the role that Egypt and Jordan had. It's not possible. There can be competition in some places, but if these axes can't really compete on the Israel-Palestinian file of all files in a time of crisis, then it brings to mind how important do we put, or how much importance do we put on these axes in analytical terms? They are important in many different ways, but we have to recognize that in some situations things just don't work out like that. And then we can look at the harshest differences of all, those between Qatar and the UAE and Turkey and the UAE. And as I said, these are beginning to thaw. Meetings between very high-level officials across the board, and very likely to continue, because as much as there will be distrust between them, the reality is that I think that the conclusion has been come to in all of these capitals, that following through on that distrust and escalating the tension only brings dividends if the surrounding atmosphere is conducive to that, resulting in Machiavellian benefits. And the surrounding atmosphere just isn't conducive to that. On the contrary, What recent history shows us is that such escalation brings about very little, even when there is an occupant in the White House that encourages the most outlandish and irresponsible behavior, which happened with Donald Trump. The moment it became clear that Trump might not actually get a second term, calculations were changed across American allies in the region, and they all pointed to one inescapable conclusion, that an escalation in tensions would bring about no bonuses and would almost definitely result in more losses. Part of that also has to do, of course, not only with the absence of a Trumpian imperative, but also the presence of a Biden one, which in regards to the region involves an attempt, I'm not sure how this will go, but an attempt to some sort of return to an Iran nuclear deal. And the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular, of course, going to be concerned about that, and they know that they stand a much better chance of ameliorating how much damage such a deal will cause for their own interests, given Tehran's designs on the region, if they're able to positively engage with DC. And indeed, the Saudis themselves are probably not convinced that the previous Trump strategy of maximum pressure has done particularly much good. And if they want to find a way to minimize damage in the coming period, they can't afford to have bad relations with DC. For all the poles and axes that might arise, relations with the most powerful superpower in the world remains paramount in some way. But let's magnificently destructive, awful ways. Not least, one has to be clear, in Syria, where the most brutal regime in my lifetime, with the assistance of Iran, has managed to destroy so much of Syria. And I wanted to mention this in particular because there's some kind of ridiculous nonsense that portends that the main perpetrator of evil in Syria is the West or external Arab meddling actors. It isn't, and that's nonsense. It's the Assad regime and its allies who sacrificed the well-being of Syria on the altar of geopolitics, maintaining a certain level of geopolitical balance that they felt would be upset by the presence of a more representative government in Syria. Even with the combined damage done by the nihilistic and barbaric ISIS group across the world, it cannot compare to the brutality of the Assad regime in Syria alone, and it will be the albatross that we rightfully wear across our necks as the so-called international community that could not stop and would not stop what was happening there. The same is true in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia has created so much destruction of its own against another cultish and caustic group, that of the Houthis, and that conflict, while thankfully winding down in terms of intensity of violence, is still an incredibly awful humanitarian situation. And it will mean scars for yet another generation of Yemenis who deserve so much better. Lest we be under any kind of illusion, divisions remain. They are salient and they have horrible impacts for people. But looking ahead, as I said earlier, it's only a matter of time when we're going to surpass them at some point, and it's not going to be in the far distant future because, and this is where I think we need to consider things very carefully as we look at the future, there are going to be new fault lines in this part of the world, and those fault lines are going to be far more existential. It's not a cheerful thing to have to note that demographic developments, combined with the impending climate crisis that is slowly but surely creeping upon us, are probably going to make all these arguments that we've seen play out in the last decade or so seem rather inconsequential. But that, I think, really is the reality of our situation. The climate crisis is a real and prescient danger to not only our children and our grandchildren, but I expect to most of us in this audience. It gets worse with time, true, but it doesn't skip us over. The impacts are already becoming very self-evident. The question for us as scholars and those trying to explain this region is simply as this: how will the region respond to this, and what will these countries do going forward? Are they going to form new alliances as water itself becomes a prized commodity? Are they going to engage in new conflicts due to environmental pressures? How will their intellectual universes face these new challenges, hitherto unheard of in human history? As yet, we have precious little evidence to support much by way of theories and speculations, and that in itself is deeply concerning. Instead, we see the playing out of petty tribalism on the regional international stages under the guise of intellectual inquiry, rather than the exploration of genuine knowledge aimed at addressing these issues. If we had even a portion of attention that was dedicated to the supporting of authoritarianism or in contrast, the supporting of different types of autocratic political Islamism, reapportioned that effort, that energy, instead to analyzing the predicament that the world finds itself in the climate crisis, that would be monumental indeed. If I may, I would suggest that as we try to understand the world within analytical circles, more generally speaking, we do the following. 1, to recognize that the world is indeed moving very fast. Again, better or for worse, and often for worse. We need to adapt, and we need to adapt very quickly, and that does not easily come to the analyst and particularly to the academic. And I hold up my hands and say, I'm part of that category myself. We live in a time that is unlike any other, where the pace of change is unlike any other period that came before it. Indeed, it would not be hyperbole to note that 10 years of change in this century can be as impactful as 100 years of change in other centuries. And we're not so ready for that as we might imagine. Secondly, we have to recognize that hitherto we've not sufficiently drawn on all the resources within our analytical arenas and promoted different voices enough. Voices that represent our diversity of gender, our diversity of ethnicity and background. And I would humbly suggest that we all, without exception, and again, myself included, we all need to do better in this regard. This is not about tokenism, but it's about realizing that different perspectives emanate from different life experiences, and different perspectives enrich our discussions at a time when we desperately need them. As an academic, but also as somebody who moves around in policy think tanks and research institutes and government, I'm astounded as we see panels of experts on countries in the region that they fail to speak even the language of. Or maybe they visit for a week or two out of the year. Or both, they have neither the language skills nor the experience. We all need to do better. And finally, I would offer a call that encourages us all to support our intellectual spaces, including most certainly this glorious institution, the European Institute of the Mediterranean, within the virtual walls of which we ought to be very gratified we're having this discussion. There are going to be tremendous pressures insisting that we reallocate resources and time away from various topics and subjects, and we have to recognize and ensure that as we move forward in these next phases, we do so with the recognition that knowledge is its own virtue and very important to promote. And that come what may, we are called upon to be more, not less human, and the human beings without knowledge simply cannot uphold their fundamental freedoms, their rights, and their responsibilities. Now, at this point, usually the audience expects me to deliver new solutions and new paradigms and new ideas. I have students that ask me about this from within the realm of political science. I have concerned, deeply committed individuals of the Arab world that ask me about this from within the realm of activism. I have policymakers who, in different countries, who ask me the same question from within the machinery of government. And I'm afraid I will have to disappoint you tremendously because I don't have new solutions. What I have is a single paradigm. If we're going to have large and majestic discussions around geopolitics, around grandiose theories regarding grand bargains, let's be sure to note that we need to root it in two things. Those two things entail the sum of the answer that I give to policymakers, to my students and analysts anytime they ask. And my answer is always going to be the same, and perhaps you'll find this cynical, but in the world in which we live, I frankly find it radical. And I tell them just to be true and to be honest. I tell them to be true to the ideal of upholding fundamental freedoms that are the birthright of every free human being on this earth. And I tell them to be honest in bearing witness to the abuses, the trauma, the horror of appalling conditions in this part of the world for so many people of this part of the world. I tell them if they want to know what's really happening on the ground, that they should listen to the rights activists who document these things against great odds from within these countries or have been forced to flee as a result of threats to themselves and their families. I tell them never to accept the Faustian argument of considering things as, well, it's just too complicated. That wrong is wrong and that right is right. That occupation is occupation, irrespective of how apologists for occupation want to describe it. That authoritarianism is authoritarianism, irrespective of how much people want to try to dress it down as some kind of lesser of two evils. That extremism is extremism, and that is true whether it's underpinned by some sort of heretical neo-interpretation of religion or right-wing forces that claim to be religious or anti-religious. I tell them to reject treating the peoples of this region as being somehow incapable or unable to live free and to live free well. That this kind of soft bigotry, and it's really quite hard bigotry, of low expectations is what allowed colonialism to continue, what allowed our support for autocrats and dictators to continue, what allowed occupation and dispossession to continue, and that the peoples of this region deserve better. Perhaps you were all expecting me to give some sort of grand theory about how to replace the current geopolitical dispensation and with what precisely. But if I'm honest about this, the truth is no grand theories are going to make too much of a difference unless they have at their root either prescription for including the upholding of fundamental freedoms and rights, or a provision for allowing the space to develop so that such freedoms and rights can be arrived at. The latter is very risky indeed, because in the meantime, there are all sorts of unintended and unexpected consequences we might have to deal with. But be true and bear witness. I have really nothing more important than that. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Hellyer. I'm speechless. I'm speechless because what you said really resonates in many of the attempts we have from the European Institute of the Mediterranean to allow for this exchange. I have several questions here myself, but I invite the audience to write down their questions on the Q&A tool that we have at the bottom of the screen, also through chat. Okay, but I have tons of questions I could start with. I think that my first question was, and you already answered it, who are we ignoring? Which voices are we ignoring in this equation? And you say these people from the ground. But do you think, you said these two axes, and with this simplistic framework of revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, we are missing someone here. Who are the true revolutionaries in the region? And probably this is the part that we ignore. And this is the segment of society that has suffered the most for the last decade. Okay, so how can we engage with them? How can we engage with them without a paternalistic tone? We do not have to teach them anything because they are doing their own revolution in a sense. But how? And there's always this tendency to try to teach them. That could be my first question: how to engage with them? Sure. How to do justice to what they are doing and what they are suffering. Also, my second reflection could be how we tend to analyze the region from a very static image, ignoring the underground movements that shake societies, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is also linked with this segment of society that we are not listening to. At the level of policy making, we are trapped in a binomial which is lethal, as either pragmatism or idealism. If you are an idealist, you would like to construct a peaceful region, you would like to do things better, but you are trapped in this idea that, okay, we have to engage. And then we see, for example, President Macron allying with the Egyptian regime for counter-terrorist purposes. We are also, again, buying stability at the expense of sustainability and freedom. So how to, in a certain way, how to push our policymakers to be more honest and to be more brave in dealing with the region.
So, first, those are very good questions. I have a few comments before I get into them. First, I don't actually think it was the revolutionaries that suffered the most, if I'm honest. Because the reality is that, although of course they did suffer, and of course it depends who you define as revolutionaries, but really the impacts of damage were felt, far beyond them. You look at Yemen, for example. It's not the revolutionaries that suffered the most. It's just the people of Yemen, writ large en masse. Same thing in Syria, and so on. But I see what you mean. And of course, for people who have read my book on Egypt, they'll know that as much as I try to be analytical in my perspective, that I have a particular sort of empathy for those who really believed in the promise of the 25th of January uprising in 2011. They were a very small group, I have to say. They were a very small group. And maybe this was a big mistake that they themselves did not, that they perpetrated themselves, early on, that they thought actually maybe they're more popular than they are. So I think that that's, a bit of an issue. Now, you ask about how can we support them. It's a difficult question on a practical level, but I'm leaving out the practicalities for a second, but also on a principled level. Who are we to support, or who are we to engage, right? And I'm very sensitive about this because, again, on a practical level, but also on a principled one, because very often, for example, we might try to quote-unquote help, and it's incredibly arrogant, it's very paternalistic, as you point out, it's very parochial, but also it can be very damaging. Sometimes the last thing, people want within the region is help from, or particular types of help from the West, because it makes them targets, okay? And sometimes it's for other reasons as well, that they're just not very happy with how they're doing that help. But, we have to be very cautious about that. And the way in which I tell people to do it is, if you want to help a particular group or a particular issue, you need to talk to people who are there. You need to talk to people who are on the ground. You need to talk to the people that you claim you want to help directly and see, what do they need? What do they want? Okay. And then decide if you're able to do it. Okay. But, don't make the assumptions, because assumptions can really hurt them. Okay. So that's one aspect of it. The other is that, when we're talking about engaging with other states, these are sovereign nation states, and we exist in a world where international order is already sort of being torn apart at the seams. We're probably going, I really hope I'm wrong about this, but we're probably going to war, when it comes to Ukraine later this year. I hope I'm wrong, I really do. But, if there was ever international order, and I happen to believe that it's been a lot more fragile for a much longer time compared to many of my colleagues, but we don't want to contribute to the breaking down of an order that is already bad enough, but the breaking down of it would be even worse. Okay, but it's not an either or situation, because as sovereign states, all of these states have signed up to particular international treaties, particular international protocols. They're members of the United Nations. They're signatories to, the International Court, etc., 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 or regional human rights. They've already signed up to a bunch of things, and if they, our responsibility, I think, if we really want to promote a better kind of relationship, is to insist that we all just uphold these standards. Now, we have a problem in this regard, because we ourselves don't always uphold these standards. Okay? So, taking, some of the more obvious ones are, things like the invasion of Iraq, but, leaving that aside, even domestically, I'm afraid it's very difficult for us to go to some of these states and say, for example, you need to be better on minorities, when we have, people like Viktor Orban talking about Muslims and Arabs in the ways that he did and does, when we have people like Emmanuel Macron, mainstreaming further and further to the right on, minority questions, it becomes really difficult, So we have to also look at ourselves, and if we're going to uphold certain principles, that we need to apply them very clearly to ourselves. In terms of our policymakers being honest and more brave, things aren't getting any better in that regard. Again, going back to the domestic, it's frankly very disappointing. No, disappointing is the wrong word. It's embarrassing for me to watch how my own government, and I'm sorry, you guys are going to get a British perspective on this, as if you don't have enough of it in the media. We have a government that, has told us for the last 2 years, be careful about gathering and, COVID-19 and so on, which, we try to keep to, and we find out they're all having parties. They're literally having parties, So I'm not so sure that that's the best place for us to look, but we don't really have much in the way of options, right? Our policymakers are not necessarily all going to be brave at home, so I'm not sure that we're going to expect to be brave overseas. But this is also an ongoing question throughout policy institutions, because the fact of the matter is that many of our brightest are simply not heading into politics, that they're fed up with politics, so they're heading into the private sector. Okay, when Merkel retired, that was a big milestone for me. And I'm not German. I have, I don't have any connection to the country, but she was one of the last few, quote unquote, adults of a particular era where politics really mattered, really, really mattered. And now I think a lot of people, they just head into the private sector. So, and it's not to say that there aren't wonderful people that do exist within, different diplomatic services and different domestic services and so on. Of course there are. I know many of them, and they're very decent people, but they'll tell you themselves they're struggling against, the overarching sort of environment that just doesn't care enough. So it's an ongoing question, and it's why it's so important for the rest of us that really take these things seriously to bear witness and to continue to do good work, so that people know what's going on.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions from Professor Rafael Bustos. He's a very good colleague and one of the best experts we have on particularly Algeria. And he has two questions. The first one is, I'm going to read them. Those two axes are backed by the same Western powers, but known by the Russian Federation. And the second one is, other countries like Algeria, Syria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Iran are not part of neither of the two axes, and some of them have Russia behind. What may be the role in dissolving the two axes?
I didn't understand the first question. You said that Russia isn't involved in either of the axes?
That's what he says.
Okay, very good. So, I mean, there are going to be not just two relationships underway, but actually multiples. Okay, so as I said during the talk, it's not simply sufficient that you think about these axes. There are other things that also happen, right? So I didn't mention China that much. Okay, China is an increasingly important actor within the region. I didn't talk about Russia that much, but Russia is also an increasingly, well, not increasingly, but is an important player in how certain things turn out. Particularly when you think about particularly when you think about Syria and Libya. Okay, so it's not that these things are simply irrelevant. It's just that there are other aspects of a broader analytical frame that we need to keep in mind. The same thing when it comes, by the way, to Iran and Saudi. As much as I said that if we just limit it to that, then we're not really going to explain very much. That competition continues to exist and is important to keep in mind. When it comes to the Russians, they have very good relations with some of these countries. Very good relations. Okay, they have good relations with the GCC, and they continue to have good relations with the GCC, even when big powers in the GCC were on opposite sides of the Russians in Syria. The Turks and the Russians have good relations, even again when they had very opposing views when it came to Syria, and so on. Right, so it's not that it's an either or sort of analytical frame. But I appreciate the question because it reminds us that there are these different angles that need to be taken into account. What was the second question again? I'm sorry.
The second question was that other countries like Algeria, Syria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Iran are not part of neither of the two axes, and some of them have Russia behind. What might be the role in dissolving these two axes?
Okay, so I'm not sure if they all don't have, relations. So at the moment, for example, Syria is certainly far more akin to the latter axis than to the former. Although again, that's beginning to dissipate a little bit, but it's. I think that's definitely the case, and normalization with the Assad regime is happening, right? Algeria, I think, and I'm not an Algeria expert. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about Algeria and pretend that I know Algeria. As a side note, I frankly don't like Middle East experts who pretend to know the entirety of the Middle East. We're talking about 22 Arab countries, let alone more that are considered to be about the modern Middle East. And anybody who says that they know what's going on in each and every one of them is either foolish or lying. I'm sorry, it's rather silly. So we try to do our best, but I really don't know Algeria enough in order to make anything more than the most generalistic of comments. But what I see, what I observe, is that Algeria is suspicious about being embroiled in either of these axes and maintains good relations with both. This is what I see, and I could be very wrong. Okay, in terms of dissipating the axes, if that's what the question was, and I hope I understood it, it's not really something that we can do. It's something that they decide. This is something else that, again, I'm not saying that the questioner is making this argument, but very often I see this within particularly academic circles, not so much analytical ones within the West, that seem to think that we are so responsible for everything and so powerful that we can actually change everything if we just make the right policy decision. And I think we need to be a bit more humble than that. The reality is that the biggest consequential actors in all of these disputes are the actors themselves. Okay, so people say, oh well, if the U.S. would just change its policy on this country or that country, then everything would change overnight. And say, no, they make these decisions because they want to make these decisions, and they can be really, really bad decisions, and they very often are bad decisions, but they are their decisions. They're not getting a phone call from D.C. and saying, you know what, I'm going to close the parliament and suspend the constitution because DC told me to. It doesn't work like that. Or indeed other places too. What happened in Tunisia, for example, last year, I believe fundamentally that was Qais Said. Okay, that was the president of Tunisia making that call. I think it was wrong, personally. I don't think this was the best idea, and we wait to see how it will turn out, I suppose. But I think it was fundamentally a Tunisian affair. Now, does that mean that other actors don't try to get involved and seek opportunities? Of course they do. It's very obvious. But I think we sometimes underestimate how significant and powerful and consequential the actors are themselves in their own places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have another question from Mario Roderick regarding Tunisia, and he says, how should the European Union engage with Tunisia in order to support its democratic process? What is the EU not doing or could do?
Tunisia is very difficult in terms of external kind of interaction, in my opinion. I think that the democratic experiment in Tunisia was extremely valuable, not only for Tunisia, but wider in the region. And I hate to put that burden on my Tunisian friends that they didn't ask for, okay? They did not request to be the flag bearer in this sort of way, but, they started the uprisings themselves. So, that's what it is. And I'm not enthusiastic in the slightest about what has happened over the past year. But as in since the summer of 2021, but I don't know what we can do, really. I think that we can simply remind and continue to uphold, as I said, anything that has already been agreed in terms of international treaties, and just push on that sort of level. But it also becomes very difficult because we're also in a time where a lot of foreign aid goes to places like Tunisia, and a lot of it has to do with humanitarian sort of work about, and particularly during the time of the pandemic, one has to be very, very careful about how they withdraw support, because you don't want the support to be felt, or the lack of support to be felt, beyond the bad actors that you're trying to impact. Right? And that's very difficult. I don't have an answer to that. All right? I agree with those who are very concerned about the trajectory. I do. And I don't disagree that there need to be policy changes in order to take that into account. I'm just not sure about how best to do that. And again, I keep on going back to thinking, okay, what are rights organizations on the ground who take these things seriously? What are they asking for? What are they requesting? Okay, because I think that they are at least vital components of the conversation. Keeping in mind, before I wrap up on this question, and perhaps this is why I'm feeling a bit reluctant and reticent, is because I also know that the bandwidth in so many European Union institutions, but also just in EU member states, the bandwidth for taking on different problems has shrunk tremendously because we have so many problems on the continent itself. And we've had many crises. They're not comparable crises. Okay, as much as I'm very disappointed about what happened with Brexit, it's not comparable to any of these crises that we see in the Middle East. But it just means that the bandwidth for discussion just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. We should be able to, as somebody said, walk and chew gum at the same time, huh? But the fact of the matter is that policy institutions don't work like that. So I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers in that regard, but just a general comment that I too am extremely concerned about the trajectory. I think that there is potential to salvage, something from this in Tunisia. I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
We just lost you for a second. We have a question from Andrea Viñas. She says, thank you so much, Dr. Hellyer, for your lecture. Very enlightening. I was wondering how political parties and leaders in the Arab world, those who are strongly linked with Islam, are driving those types of conflicts and explaining them to their own population. Which is the message behind? Is the population following them? Thank you so much. Says.
This is a really interesting question. It's gone. I was just going to say, it's just I'm not quite clear on precisely what they're asking. So I don't know if they can perhaps clarify. Because when it comes to Islam, for example, most political leaders in the region are Muslim. Okay. So I'm not. I'd like to understand what quite he meant. Is he talking about particular groups, or I didn't quite understand the question.
I think she was referring to leadership, political leaderships, and probably I imagine she was referring to conservative monarchies that are legitimated by Islam. Probably. I think that.
Yeah, she's writing politicians mainly. Okay, and are the populations behind them? So I'm going to answer this, but you're going to have to tell me if I'm even answering the right question, Andrea, because what you asked could be interpreted in many different ways, and I'm not really sure quite what you were interested in. So please forgive me, and feel free to type into the box if you see that I'm going in a direction that you weren't asking about. But in terms of religion, more generally, religion in the region is a value. Religion itself is not really a dividing line in terms of culture wars. As religion, okay, and this is important. What are dividing lines is what type of religion and how religion is engaged in the public arena. Okay, that's definitely a subject of debate and discussion. But generally speaking, and there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, it's not religion itself that is the dividing line. I will say that, and anecdotally, because we don't really have very good polling data on this sort of stuff anymore, but anecdotally, you have the reality that religion is being used for political purposes, and it can be very off-putting to different sectors of the populations, especially when political leaders start to do religion and they enlist religious leaders to do politics. They're not always very happy about that, I find, in discussions with different people. But I'm not sure if this is answering the question that you asked. So am I going in the right direction in terms of what you were querying? Very good. Okay, thank you.
We have another question from Gadea Carpintero saying, I would like to ask Professor Hellyer's opinion on migration geopolitics in the Mediterranean. I am actually thinking on the so-called externalization of border policies and mechanisms practiced by the EU. Do Arab powers have the autonomy that the professor upholds they have?
So, it's a good question, but let me be clear. I never said that the Arab powers have the autonomy on migration policies at all. They don't. Okay? It's something that I think many of us forget, that while as Europeans we basically have freedom of movement completely, not only within Europe but across the Arab world, across the Middle East, the reverse is definitely not true. And I can tell you horror stories of people that they're trying to get a visa to do things that you or I as Europeans would probably take 10 minutes to achieve, if we didn't just get it on arrival. And they're going through hell and back with incredibly humiliating and frankly depraved practices. And these are the ones that apply for visas, let alone the ones that are fleeing conflict zones. And I think it says something about us tremendously that we have this discussion about the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean Sea, the way in which we treat refugees that are from the Mediterranean, but also refugees that have come from further afield, that are just desperately trying to get away from those conflict zones and build a life for their families. I think it's quite grotesque how, frankly, we treat these people. It's really appalling. It really is appalling. And I have my theories and my thoughts as to why that's the case. And you probably won't be surprised if I tell you that I think it is rooted in bigotry. But this is the reality I think that we have, and it's very telling of what has happened to us as Europeans, that we have come so, frankly, easily to that sort of level of depravity. And it is really depraved. I think it really is depraved. And it explains a lot in terms of how we engage with the region, that we're willing to accept things that we apparently wouldn't accept otherwise, but we do so because, God forbid, we should have a few more brown people. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have some questions that I think I will die if I'm not seizing this opportunity. You mentioned asset rehabilitation. Just 6 days ago, Assad bombed Afrin with several civilian casualties, children, women. It bombed schools, health centers, marketplaces. And in the meanwhile, every night, children in the north region of Syria are dying because of cold. Hypothermia is killing children directly. And at the same time, we are seeing a gradual rehabilitation of Al-Assad in the region, and some sort of uncomfortable justification in the West saying, okay, we need to sacrifice Syria for the sake of saving Lebanon. What is true and what is Manichaean in that argument that in order to save Lebanon, we need to swallow Assad in Syria? And do you think that the West in general, the EU, but also the United States, will quickly or in a certain way rehabilitate Assad?
So I don't buy the argument about Lebanon, because I think that this trend was happening before Lebanon became such a crisis. And I think that generally speaking, there was a lot of rhetoric about supporting Syria in the early years of the uprising, and a lot of people sort of jumped on the bandwagon, which I was not unhappy about, because I hoped that there would be a thoughtful transition that would take place, but would require a lot of pressure and so on. Okay, the reality is that a lot of people have invested a lot in that sort of rhetoric, and now they don't really want to do it anymore. That they're not really as fussed as they claimed that they were. That it's tougher than what they thought, and Syrians aren't that important to them, frankly. And they also get worried about Syrians coming into the West. So, they're not really too fussed about that. And they're also thinking in very short-term sorts of ways. The reality is that these types of regimes are incredibly unstable and produce more instability over time, but very often it's not immediate. So you get short-term stability, i.e. lack of war, but in exchange for a much more unstable system altogether, which can, erupt at any time. So even on a very pragmatic, realist kind of level, this is a bad idea. And of course, I think that this is incredibly unethical because, again, the suffering that takes place in the meantime is tremendous. And I unfortunately think that when it comes to the EU and to the US, that there will be a pause, and there will be this hand-wringing that takes place, but it's really just about making people feel better. It's really about just making us feel that, we're not quite so heartless as these policies might suggest. So we need to slow them down so we don't make ourselves feel worse. But no, it's hand-wringing. It's not real. And you see it it's not just on Syria. You see it on multiple sorts of issues that take place where
we lost you. We lost you just 1 second ago.
Okay, you've got me now.
Yeah.
But where people talk about Russia and Ukraine, but they're not willing to take the steps on Russia. On the contrary, they're holding steps back, because they see other things that they want. So, it's not just on the region, I suppose, but there's certainly that sort of imperative. And again, I hate to keep on bringing this up, but I think it's important. There's a lot of bigotry involved in this. If Syrians, I'll be really frank, and I'll probably get into a lot of trouble for this, but I'm past the point of caring. If Syrians were white and Christian, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and we wouldn't have had this conversation for the past decade.
Yeah. I normally call that selective empathies.
Absolutely, and very temporary.
Empathize.
And very temporary as well, Anyway.
Okay, and you said that we could have a final word about the so-called normalization. I mean, and the Emirates as one of the main protagonists of these Abraham Accords. Do you think that this normalization of Israel with several Arab countries, is that really a path to peace or a way to future conflict? At the moment, for example, we are living very closely here in Spain what has implied, for example, for Morocco and for the Western Sahara issue, and we are following that very closely. But to what extent this is going to be just more conflict for the future, or no, if this is going to impose a sort of artificial peace?
So I don't know if it will fuel more conflict. That's to be decided. I will say it won't solve any conflict, because first of all, let's be clear. When we talk about Arab normalization, we don't have normalization underway. We have a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that is 40 years old. There's no normalization between Egypt and Israel. There are diplomatic relations, but normalization between the populations is absent and will remain absent until there is a solution to the Palestine question. Okay? The same thing with the Jordanians. Okay? So when we talk about this new sort of development that involves the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, and to a much lesser extent the Moroccans, and to an even lesser extent the Sudanese, we're not talking about normalization on a scale that really even accounts for more than a few percent of Arabs in the first place. Okay, the populations in this regard are tiny. And even those populations, so when the Bahrainis signed the normalization paper, signed the Abraham Accords, there were protests in Bahrain. Okay, I mean, Bahrainis en masse, I don't think were particularly enthusiastic, and I don't think we'll be particularly enthusiastic until there is a just solution to the Palestine question. When it comes to the UAE, it's not easy to track, how popular this is on the ground, to put it lightly. But even if it is, then you're not talking about Arab normalization, because I don't think this necessarily creates a domino effect anywhere in the region anyway, any more than the Egyptian one did. And Egypt is the largest Arab country by far in terms of population, and it didn't lead to a domino effect at all. Okay, and that was at a much more sort of influx kind of time where that would have been far more possible, in my opinion. When it came to the Moroccans, Morocco had a certain type of diplomatic relationship with the Israelis back in the 90s, which is very limited. Mauritania did too, by the way. Okay, late 90s, early 2000s, for a short period of time, and it didn't really go anywhere. Okay, and the Mauritanians broke it off, and the Moroccans, they also didn't proceed. I think in this particular case, they saw an opportunity and they went for it. The opportunity being the United States will recognize our sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is like a big policy win for Morocco. So that's what they did. But I don't know if they're going to go any further than that, because I don't know if they want to go any further than that. They kind of, they went back to the status quo ante of the late 90s, early 2000s. They didn't do more than that. So far, maybe they'll change that, but they didn't do that so far, and they got something really big out of it. I don't think any other country is like that. When it came to Sudan, frankly, Sudan was blackmail. Sudan it has a huge humanitarian disaster, holding in front of them, and the terrorism designation was a real albatross around their necks. So I'm not surprised that they went for it, but they also didn't exactly go for it. I mean, this is something that people don't quite understand, that yes, they agreed to Trump's proposal, but the proposal said, this will all be subject to a vote in the assembly that has not been established yet, and will not be established for some time. And I find it difficult to imagine that at least a freely elected Sudanese assembly is going to say, yeah, let's normalize. Okay, so I think that these things will remain quite limited until there's a solution to the Palestine question. And maybe that's not what people want to hear. Maybe they want to get on this bandwagon of, oh, this is a great move for peace and so on. And, I'm sorry. You can talk about peace as much as you want, but an occupation is an occupation, and it is going on. It is expanding, and it happens, by the way, at the same time as discussions are developing in places like Washington, D.C., where increasingly more political voices are expressing their concerns about the occupation itself and the nature of it, calling it out very bluntly as apartheid. Okay, so I don't think that this is going away. I think that that there are people who want to sort of, sweep it under the carpet. I just don't think it's very practical for them to continue in that illusion.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I don't know if I can abuse to make them. But one is on what are the prospects for Islamism, taking into account the situation that Islamist political parties are in certain countries, like in Tunisia, but also in Egypt, but also taking into account the divide within the Muslim Brotherhood leadership in Europe and in Turkey, and how they approach the reality on the ground in the region. What do you think is going to happen with particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, and as an international movement, but also in its own political process in several countries?
That's a very interesting question. I frankly don't know. Islamism has so many different manifestations. Even if we're just talking about Islamist political groups that aren't in power, Okay, even if we're just limiting to that, there's so many different types of them, ranging from An-Nahda in Tunisia to different brotherhood chapters in Jordan, to Hamas, to the Egyptian Brotherhood, to Islah. I mean, there's so many, different groups that are out there, and I think it's important to distinguish between them and to recognize that they're not all the same. They don't all think the same. Whether or not that means that they're all great or something, I just think it's very silly. And you see this quite regularly in analytical discussions where people want to say, is it this or is it this? Are they progressive Democrats, or are they basically Al-Qaeda in suits? It's like, they don't need to be one or the other. There's lots of things in between. In the same way that you have many different types of socialist groups and many different types of communist groups and many different types of nationalist groups or liberal groups. I mean, there's such wide variety. We have that in our own societies. Okay, so I don't know why we expect that lack of complexity is going to exist in other societies. So I frankly don't know. I think that when you talk about certain groups, you mentioned the Brotherhood in Turkey, so the leadership is in exile. But even the Brotherhood leadership in exile that's in Turkey, they are undergoing their own challenges now, because the Turks have made it very clear that they want to engage in rapprochement with the Egyptians and with the Emiratis. And part of the attempt when it came to the Egyptians was, I think, to narrow the space within Turkey for the leadership or for the activists of these particular groupings. I'm not sure if it's confirmed, saying that Erdogan may expel the leadership of Hamas. So we don't know. I think that there's an expectation that there could be prediction that sort of pans out very easily, but the region is still in a significant amount of flux. There are different crises underway, and things will develop over time. There'll be rethinking that takes place, I'm sure, among many of these groups. There'll be a hardening of positions in many of these groups as a result of what they feel they experience, and so on and so on. I mean, it's very difficult to have any prediction on that. So I'd rather be called the analyst that said it's complicated than be the analyst that got things very wrong in a prediction. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. As a final note, taking into account your expertise, you have written about Muslims of Europe. I think that, I am really concerned myself of where are we heading regarding our relation with Muslimness in Europe, taking into account that taking into account that we are in a French EU presidency that is going probably to convey the own debate that they have had inside France, and in a certain way, a certain trend to criminalize Muslim activism and equate it to Islamism as such. Okay, this is a trend that might have echoes in the coming months in Europe. Where do you think we are heading? Do you share my certain concern, pessimism on that? Or do you think that in a way we will be able to realize that Muslim activism is any kind of citizen activism that is entitled to go on and to exist in the European ground?
So when we say Muslim activism, we're really talking about any type of activism that takes place at the hands of people who self-identify as Muslim. And they might be religious, they might not be religious, they might be religious but are doing this activism on the basis of any number of political frameworks, etc. Okay, so it's not necessary, in fact it's probably more often not the case that when they do get involved, I mean, in your own country, there are, I'm sure, many Muslim Spaniards who are involved in mainstream politics, and you know that they're Muslim and they might be, quite religious, but they're just involved in mainstream politics. That's also Muslim politics and Muslim activism because they're Muslims. Okay, when it comes to more religiously inspired sort of things, I've seen this in many different countries where Muslim citizens or Christian citizens are engaged in mainstream politics, and they are personally motivated by their religion as Christians, as Muslims, as Jews, and they use those imperatives as justifications for their getting involved in mainstream political forces and mainstream political parties. It's natural. And then there'll be many people who don't, and that's also something that exists quite plentifully, right? So I think that that's something to keep in mind. The second is, I think your concerns are warranted. I think that they're most certainly warranted, and I'm particularly concerned about France because the center of gravity in French politics is moving further and further to the right. And you have people like Eric Zemmour come out where, you could never have dreamed that that would be the case maybe 10 years ago. And now it's very natural to assume. And, I still reckon that if Zemmour went up against Macron, then Macron would win. But how on earth did we get to a point where Zemmour could even be considered as somebody who would get into the runoff? Okay, but then last time it was Marine Le Pen. Of course, Zemmour is much worse, which is incredible to think, right?
Yeah.
I think that's even worse, right? But this is the responsibility, frankly, of people like Macron and people who are in the center and people who are on the left who have, let alone, of course, people on the right, who have allowed this sort of sentiment to become mainstreamed without challenging it. And on the contrary, they're not just not challenging it, they're channeling it. And they're using it for populist political benefit. And we've seen that it's not just in France. I don't want to pick on the French. It's very clear across the board in many countries in Europe, in the United States. We live in that sort of time where othering Muslim citizens and problematizing their Muslimness, if it is visible, okay, and of course the most visible are going to be people who are of a different color and who are women who wear the headscarf, okay, which is why you get such vicious vitriol against someone like Ilhan Omar in the United States, because she's a refugee, she's an immigrant, she's black, she's Muslim, and she wears the hijab, okay, so most of the time it's not even about what she says, it's about who she is, all right, even if what she says I don't necessarily agree with, which happens more than once, but it's about who she is. And you see that tremendously in other places as well. Even in my own country, in the United Kingdom, we've had scandal after scandal over the last few years about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, which is the ruling party, within the Labour Party, which is the opposition party. There's been all of these sorts of scandals which haven't been taken seriously by the mainstream, in my opinion, enough. We just had, a government advisor come out a couple of days ago and say, I was appointed as advisor on Islamophobia 2 years ago, and I haven't had anybody call me in the last 2 years, on Islamophobia, and another government minister saying, I think she said I was passed over for a job because I'm Muslim. Or something to that effect. It was Nusrat Ghani. I don't want to put words into her mouth, but you can look this up very easily. But and these things just go on and on and on. Like the former chairwoman of the Conservative Party, Baroness Saida Warsi, talking about how anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test. It's become part of respectable conversation to have, which is it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people allow it to happen and push it forward, and it does concern me. Because as Europeans, we need to remember we don't have the greatest track record when it comes to pluralism. We do not. We have a good track record when it goes past the 1950s, okay? Or let's say better than many other places. But pre that, we have a very bad track record, okay? And it was only 20 or so years ago that we had the Bosnian genocide. People have to think about these things. It's not about scaremongering. It's not being about alarmists. It's about remembering that the respect for pluralism and respect for a pluralistic society is hard won, hard fought for, but also has to be hard held. Has to be kept, and it's a constant battle to ensure that we actually hold that up. It doesn't happen simply naturally. Okay, no, it needs to be fought for. day in, day out.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, because I mean, I think that you have been very inspiring and very honest, as you say. We have no solutions. We have no magical potions that can sort out the problems that we are facing. But it's important that we are aware of them, and that we are honest with ourselves and with our own limitations and with our own capacities. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also part of this program to try to engage young people to see differently things, and from different perspectives, from different disciplines. And I think that your intervention today really responded to this will and to this endeavor. So I really thank you. I really thank you for your generosity in answering so many questions, so many of my questions, which I couldn't help putting them on the table. And I really hope, inshallah, we can have you in Barcelona soon, after we get better from this pandemic, and continue sharing thoughts, ideas with you and with the rest of our colleagues and students in the program. So thank you very much, and hope you have a very nice day and a very nice week, and hope to meet you very soon, inshallah, in Barcelona or elsewhere.
I hope so. Anytime. I look forward to it.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you, and see you in the next Aula Mediterrània conference.
Thank you again very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.